So for this episode, let's talk about the U.S. Constitution and suggest some new amendments. Preface, I am not a lawyer or pre-law, so sorry if my legal lingo is terrible. I think before I can make videos suggesting new law and policy ideas, we need to address the Constitution because all law and policy is filtered through it. However, existing on a constitutional level is not a guarantee if you have a Supreme Court unwilling to uphold your rights. Just look at civil rights cases of 1883, Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, Williams v. Mississippi, 1898, Giles v. Harris, 1903, not to mention the cases that strike down class-based progressive policies like Lochner v. New York, 1905. I will link these down in the video description. The U.S. Constitution is the second framework from which this country operates from. The first being the Articles of Confederation, but that setup was too restrictive on central or federal power, so a new government structure was created. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution were created to assuage the fears of those who did not want a stronger federal government and thus are known as the Bill of Rights. Curious trivia time! The Bill of Rights were initially 12 amendments, but the 11th and 12th did not gain enough support to come into force. Plus 10 is a nice number. However, due to a procedural loophole, the 11th failed amendment was still up for voting and became the 27th amendment to the Constitution after 202 years and a little over 7 months. To date, there are 27 amendments, with the 21st nullifying the 18th. This also means that an amendment has a 1/18th chance or 5.56% chance of being removed, or a 1 in 20 or 5% chance of being removed, depending on which calculation you prefer. So what do we have to do in order to propose an amendment to the U.S. Constitution? The House of Representatives and the Senate vote in favor of the proposed amendment by 2/3 in each chamber. That number is 67 for the Senate and 290 from the House of Representatives. From there, the approved amendment must be ratified by 3/4 of the states. The current number for state ratification is 38 states, and Congress can set a time limit for state ratification, which is why the proposed Equal Rights Amendment of the 1970s failed. In Method 2, like the previous mentioned method of 2/3 in both chambers of Congress, the state ratification is done through a single or multiple constitutional convention, where 3/4 is needed. 2/3 or 34 of the states call for a constitutional convention through Congress, and 3/4 of the states are needed for ratification afterwards in Method 3. In Method 4, like number 3, 2/3 of the states call for a constitutional convention but get together through constitutional conventions after Congress is finished to approve the amendment. 3/4 of the states are needed for ratification. What we have here is two methods that allow for ratification through the states on a state-by-state basis, and two methods that allow the states to gather and issue a one-vote decision, almost like a national referendum. So what constitutional amendments would I propose? Well, let's see. Proposed 20th Amendment to the Constitution, House of Representatives for D.C. and Territories. Section 1. The district constituting the seat of government of the United States and the people residing in territories administered, acquired, or controlled by the United States shall be granted the right to elect and send members to the United States House of Representatives as if they were states, and will be given the full rights and privileges given to a member of the House of Representatives from states currently in the Union. Section 2. These people are granted voting rights and protections afforded to people who reside in or claim legal residence in fully admitted states of the Union. Section 3. They shall be counted as states for the purposes of determining the number of House of Representatives that each territory and district can send. Section 3. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by the appropriate legislation. The idea is to give the people of the District of Columbia, D.C., the capital, and those presiding in overseas territories administered by the U.S. government or in communion with such representation in the House of Representatives. An old mantra of our country is no taxation without representation. People should have a say in how their government is run. Proposed 29th Amendment to the Constitution. Voting rights given to felons and those currently incarcerated. Section 1. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state or states on the account of previous criminal record or current incarceration. Section 2. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The idea is simple: to prevent states and cities from using criminality as a reason to restrict a person's right to vote. Guilty doesn't necessarily mean that the person performed a crime, as there are other compounding factors like the lack of resources for the defense and the potential acceptance and use of faulty or circumstantial evidence to obtain convictions. This is also to prevent political actors from using law enforcement to arrest and jail their political opposition supporters to suppress their vote. Those who are being judged have a right to speak about how they are being judged. Proposed 30th Amendment to the Constitution, Equal Rights Amendment. Section 1. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state or states on the account of sex and gender. Section 2. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. The idea of this amendment is to give equal protection rights to women and LGBTQIA+ people. Proposed 31st Amendment to the Constitution. Subpoena power of Congress. Section 1. The Congress shall have the power to subpoena the executive branch. Section 2. The Congress shall have the power to enforce, by appropriate legislation, the provisions of this article. Section 3. This amendment shall take effect the next presidential election year after the date of ratification. There has been a lot of debate if Congress has the right to subpoena the president. This amendment gives Congress explicit power to do so. It is my opinion that the executive branch of government has grown by a lot over the 20th and 21st century so far and needs further check and balances. An interesting case of the Supreme Court checking the power of the executive in the favor of the legislative branch of our government is United States v. Nixon, 1974, and Train v. City of New York, 1975. Proposed 32nd Amendment to the Constitution, Money and Politics. Section 1. The Congress and the states shall have the power to determine campaign and election finance. Section 2. The Congress and the states shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Section 3. This amendment shall take effect after the election for the Congressional House of Representatives elections, the date of ratification. The subject of money's role in politics has been a highly contested one. As it stands, money is seen as political speech and therefore protected by the First Amendment via Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission 2010 and McCutcheon v. Federal Election Commission 2014. With this amendment, this pulls money out of that protected status as it pertains to campaign and election finance. Rather than an outright ban, simply giving Congress the power to determine the limits should be enough and allow for nuanced law to take place without being struck down by the Supreme Court. That is, until they find another reason to protect money as it pertains to our elections. At the current trajectory, Congress can expand or increase the flow of money coming into our elections but cannot restrict. Proposed 33rd Amendment to the Constitution, Privacy Amendment. Section 1. The people shall have the right to know and determine how their private information is collected and used as it pertains to private or corporate entities. Section 2. Public officials do not have a right to privacy as it pertains to their work in public or government office. Section 3. The court shall have the power to determine the limits of privacy. Section 4. The Congress and the states shall have the power to enforce, by appropriate legislation, the provisions of this article. The right to privacy is enshrined through the 1st, 4th, and 14th Amendments to the Constitution through the right of free assembly, right to be free from unwarranted search and seizure, and a right to due process. Creating a section that combined those three would be redundant. So, the idea is to add a fourth aspect to our privacy rights, our private information as it deals with private organizations. This one really made me think. The idea of the right to privacy should be a slam dunk case, correct? Well, how does that right to privacy line up against warrants or criminal investigations? Therefore, I added Section 3 as it keeps items of public interest such as subpoenas and warrants, if legally obtained, constitutional. We want our law enforcement to be able to investigate potentially criminal acts provided they have a justifiable reason for doing so. Section 1 expands privacy rights to citizens concerning their private information. In this current digital age, information is king, and companies collecting that information are not forthcoming in how that information is being taken and used. The issue, of course, with this is if there is incriminating evidence on, say, Facebook or Twitter through private conversations, does a person have a right to delete that evidence pursuant to Section 1? Thus, what I added in Section 3 and 4 to leave the specifics to the courts through cases and litigation as well as law. Section 2 is to prevent government officials from claiming that their work is protected under Section 1, as the people have a right to know what their government is doing and to make such instruments such as freedom of information requests constitutionally more valid. So, let's stop here for now. 6 is a good number, and there are currently no other subjects I think that currently need constitutional level enshrinement. As we go through this journey together, I might think different. So if you like my content, please give my video a like or a dislike if you want. Comment down below. You can look at my video description box and find my Patreon where I do post free content, as well as Word document versions of my video for those who are hearing impaired. And thank you for coming by, and I will see you all later.